During the holidays, the amusement parks on top of department stores roared alive with the noisy voices of children. For adults shopping, children are nothing more than a nuisance. Most young couples enjoy shopping together while leaving the care of their children to their grandparents. And you can see it in this rooftop amusement centre as well. The tired faces of old men and women as energetic children drag them around. Each of the children playing in the park becomes a hero. The motorbikes shake all around. The small merry-go-round creaks as it turns. The moles pop their heads up, the paint worn off. Small humans surround all of these things, living in a world of their own making. Amongst all this peaceful noise, 2 men alone sat on a bench in silence. A tall, lanky, swarthy man, and a pale, fat man. They were appropriately dressed for the occasion, but their expressions were stern. They licked their ice creams as though being forcefully pained to do so. Everyone purposefully avoided these men who appeared to be in a bad mood. The bad taste of the ice cream was the responsibility of the ice cream store. They really didn't want to eat it. Even the unaware children withdrew from their sharp gazes as they approached and ran away. You might say, in a way, choosing this department store rooftop to have their secret meeting actually was the right choice. That was what Kabutonuma Hyosuke thought as he watched the men from a short distance away. There would be almost no one from their world watching them in a place like this. Or rather, anyone just like them would immediately stand out. There would be little fear of anyone listening in on their conversation. But at the same time, they really looked out of place. Kabutonuma had been following the tall man all morning. If he happened to fail today, then the last 3 months of effort would all go to waste. With that on his mind and confident in his abilities, he still had to be cautious. But up until that point, everything had been going smoothly. Kabutonuma was a tailing expert, but ever since that incident a few days earlier, his life drastically changed, and ever since his 5 senses had drastically improved, putting him in peak condition to track people down. The tall man had wandered around town for a few hours in the morning, then entered the tallest department store in the city, then walked around using both the elevator, escalators, and stairs. It was clear that he was being cautious of being followed and trying to shake off anyone on his tail. Yet, for Kabutonuma, he'd never had an easier target before in his life. After trying various techniques to shake someone off their tail, most people relaxed and became less prudent. The tall guy was one of those people. And yet, no matter where he went, he stood out anyway. There was no way for him to blend in with a crowd. Then, when he finally reached the rooftop, he headed straight for the bench with the other man sitting on it. Then, he sat right next to him. For Kabutonuma, you might say that today was the easiest of the last few days. So, these men, no matter how you looked at them, they seemed suspicious. The men intended to camouflage how strange it was for them to be sitting in that place by eating ice cream, but it had the opposite effect. The twitchy smile of the young ice cream shop clerk as she handed these 2 men their ice cream was honestly comical. Kabutonuma felt bad for her. But still, the men spoke in quiet voices. They licked their ice cream with sour faces, and occasionally exchanged words. He couldn't allow himself to miss out on what they were saying now. Kabutonuma took action to get closer to the men. He circled around behind them. There was a row of decorative plants behind the bench, roughly the size of a human. Kabutonuma casually walked over and observed the men from the shadows. He was still only 23 years old. Compared to the two men behind him, he didn't look so strange in this place at all. From there, he could hear their entire conversation without problem. However, if they happened to glance around and see him, they would realize they were being listened to. Kabutonuma took care not to make any noise. And sure enough, the two men didn't notice him. Their conversation proceeded without break. "But I just don't think that the chairperson needs to go as well," the tall guy said. His voice was unexpectedly deep. The fatty was stubborn. "I don't know the reason why either, but the president told me to tell you that. That's all. If you're not satisfied, then we can forget all this." "That would be a problem." The tall guy's voice was tense. "Then I'd like you to do as you're told." "All right." "Then 8 p.m. tomorrow, at G Wharf." The fatty stood up. "Tomorrow night, 8 p.m, G Wharf." It seemed they'd reached the end of their conversation, so that was all he managed to catch. But that was enough for Kabutonuma. 8 p.m. tomorrow night, G Wharf. His wish had finally come true. Behind the two men about to leave, Kabutonuma was filled with emotion. At that moment, a child about to run past Kabutonuma suddenly tripped and fell. He screamed at the top of his lungs and started crying. Kabutonuma was astonished. What on earth was this brat doing? For something like this to happen now, of all times. He prayed that the men wouldn't turn around to look at the crying child. But of course, they did. If they realized someone may have been listening in on their conversation, they'd no doubt change the appointed meeting time. For a moment, it flashed through his mind how long it had taken to catch these two men. Just how unlucky was he? That horrid memory from a few days earlier came back to mind. An unexpected nightmare waiting for him at the last minute. It was no laughing matter. But their reaction was entirely unexpected. The two men watched the crying child for a moment, and then finally turned to look at each other and laugh. Then they each hurried off their separate ways. Kabutonuma was both relieved and discouraged. The two men didn't appear to notice him at all. They had been in the midst of a very important, secret conversation. They were pros who carefully noticed the details of their surroundings so that nobody overheard them. So then, why? Were they stupid? Or had he really hidden himself that well? Either way, he'd avoided danger. When all was said and done, that was what he excelled at. And that only deepened his confidence, and as he thought about how he was getting closer to his goal, Kabutonuma was so satisfied that he felt he might scream. A few days earlier. only a few days earlier, his life was drastically changed forever. Kabuto Numa worked for the elite contract killing company, Margaret. He was one of their elite killers. Outwardly, Margaret was known as Chrysanthemum Trading. At least, that was what the sign said, but they specialized in all sorts of illegal requests, just like their name suggested. Kabuto Numa had trained ever since he was a child to become a professional killer and deal in secret intelligence. That day, he received an urgent call from the head office. "My daughter caught a cold." Then the phone hung up. It was code, meaning he had to come into the head office right away. He changed into some clothes that would allow him to blend in, and then made his way over. The head office was a single room in a multi-purpose building in the middle of the city. There were lots of suspicious companies and offices in that area. Yet, even so, no one even once suspected that one of those companies was full of contract killers. Kabuto Numa's boss, Kikyo Shinta, handed him a single photo. It was a young man wearing glasses. "We'd like you to observe this man." According to Kikyo, they'd received a background check request for the man, and after following him for several days, today would mark the final day of observations. However, he would be meeting with someone that very same day, and they needed to inform the client of everything that went down at the meeting. The man would apparently be wearing a brown shirt and carrying a small bag. "Hyosuke, you're not thinking this job will be easy, are you?" the boss said, as though seeing right through him. "I'll say this now, but if you get distracted this time, then something terrible will happen. You must carry this out seriously." The boss had never warned him like that before. The other men in the room also looked at him with serious expressions on their faces. The room was full of other members, a rare sight. There were a few dozen hired killers working for Margaret. Kabuto Numa was the youngest, at 23 years of age. Yet, he was also the one Kikyo trusted the most. While other kids were struggling to remember their multiplication tables, Kabuto Numa was learning how to handle a knife. Your ordinary killer followed a different career path. That was why Kabuto Numa was the one they went to when they needed a job to be carried out for sure. But today's job seemed even more important than that. He realized how important this job was, and so he flashed his peers a triumphant fist and left the office. As he stepped out onto the road, the reflected heat washed over him. There was a department store a 3-minute walk from the office, and in front of that store stood a large doll. It was meant to display ads for the store, but people used it as a meeting point. That man was supposed to come here, too. In the sweltering heat, he commenced his stakeout, and 30 minutes later, the man arrived. He held a small bag. The man himself was tiny and didn't stand out, but as Kabuto Numa watched him, he noticed a sharp light in his eyes. It was a trait men in Kabuto Numa's line of work all had. In an instant, he realized he wasn't dealing with any old person. If he wasn't careful, then something terrible really would happen. The man wandered around at the doll's feet for a bit, and then finally glanced at his watch and started walking back the same way he came. Kabuto-numa rushed after him. The early summer rays beamed down, causing unpleasant sweat to run down his back. It was a terrible day to focus and concentrate on tailing someone. Even for an expert such as himself, on a day like this, he could easily screw up. But it seemed the other man hadn't noticed him yet. Perhaps his concentration was waning as well. The man walked quietly with his head down, holding the small bag as though it contained something precious. After walking for about 10 minutes, the man stepped into a cafe. Perhaps he was meeting with someone there. Watching him from the outside, the man took a seat in the corner and started reading the paper whilst having a smoke. Seemed his partner wasn't there yet. After much hesitation, Kabuto-numa finally stepped into the cafe so he could continue watching the man. Normally he wouldn't go inside, but rather find a position where he could watch over the entire store. But today was so hot that he was willing to briefly set that rule aside. The feeling of the air conditioning was beyond words. Kabuto-numa went inside. He sat behind the man so that he could see him well and ordered an iced coffee. Finally, he could rest a moment as the iced coffee arrived. He took another look around, and the shop struck him as rather unremarkable. It was kind of large for a cafe, but other than that, there was nothing special about it. The iced coffee wasn't bad. But considering the weather, anything would taste good, so that was hardly commendable. Seemed the person that man was waiting for still hadn't arrived. Seemed he was getting tired of waiting as well, and he kept looking down at his watch. Forever sitting behind the man was soon going to look suspicious. He couldn't exactly overstay his welcome in the cafe either. If this person didn't show up while he was drinking his next drink, then he'd have to come up with another plan. Kabuto-numa thought as he considered ordering his second drink, and then the bell above the door tinkled. Kabuto-numa glanced over, and then froze. He would never forget the cool look on the man's face as he entered the store, despite the disgusting heat. The man's name was Dan. The two men had worked together before, meaning that Dan was also a colleague. But just because they had worked together before, that didn't mean he could let his guard down. In this line of work, you never knew when someone might catch you off guard, and that would be the end. At any rate, he would watch what was about to go down. Kabuto-numa hid his face behind a nearby newspaper as Dan walked past him. Dan walked over to the corner of the store and then sat opposite the man in the brown suit. What was going on? Kabuto-numa suddenly grew curious. That man was waiting for Dan? How did they know each other? Now things were interesting. Neither man realized Kabuto-numa was watching them, and they discussed something with the small bag between them. He wanted to get closer to see what was inside the bag, but he couldn't. Kabuto-numa found himself getting more and more irritated. Then, Dan suddenly stood up. He panicked, thinking he might be leaving, but it seemed he was going to the toilet instead. At that moment, Kabuto-numa decided. There were times where you had to do something dangerous in order to get the information you wanted. Kabuto-numa let curiosity win. It was all or nothing, sink or swim. Time to make contact with Dan. Well then, how would this go down? Kabuto Numa followed him into the toilets and stood behind him. When Dan was done and turned around, Kabuto Numa immediately called out to him. "Hey! Well, if it isn't Dan, fancy seeing you here." Dan looked up in shock. His face twisted in astonishment. "You! What are you doing here?" Dan pushed past him and ran out of the toilets. Kabuto Numa panicked and ran after him. First thing he saw was the man in the brown suit putting something wrapped in vinyl back in the bag. Then, Dan standing next to him, holding a gun. Shit! Kabuto Numa jumped to the side to avoid Dan's shot. A sharp explosion rang through the air, and something hot buzzed past Kabuto Numa's ear. It was followed by a second, then third shot. Kabuto Numa somewhat regained his composure. Dan was no good with a gun. He was simply firing at random and unable to hit anything. Kabuto Numa grabbed the glass of iced coffee from the table and put the leftover ice in his mouth. Then he turned towards Dan and spat the ice at him. It shot from his puckered lips like a bullet. It made a sharp sound and then Dan fell over backwards. Blood poured forth from his forehead. Right on target. He'd never made a shot like that before. He put another piece of ice in his mouth and, this time, turned towards the other man. At some point, the man had raised his right hand, gripping a knife. Kabuto Numa wasn't sure if he was allowed to kill this man too, but it was better than dying himself. All he could do was apologize to Kikyo about it later. As Kabuto Numa puckered his lips, the man's left hand quickly moved. He picked up the pizza on the table and tossed it like a frisbee with incredible speed. The pizza hit Kabuto Numa in the face. The man used that opportunity to grab the bag and flee the store. Of course, this meant he was leaving without paying, but the staff didn't have the courage to chase after him. For the store, this was a complete disaster. Kabuto Numa felt bad for them, but he also ran out of the store. The man was oddly fast. Kabuto Numa was confident in his own running abilities, but the distance between them got larger and larger. After chasing him for a while, the man ran into a set of warehouses that had been built out of an old train station. But then, he disappeared. Most of the warehouses appeared to be unused, and he couldn't sense anybody else around. But there was no doubt about it. The man had disappeared into one of them. Kabuto Numa decided to check each of the doors one by one to see which were unlocked. He discovered some fresh footprints in front of one of the warehouses. This was it. He wanted to burst in, but he was unarmed. He should find a weapon first. When he searched his breast pocket, he found a ballpoint pen. He should be able to use this. He held it lightly between his thumb and middle finger and placed his forefinger along the length of the pen. Kabuto Numa could use even a pen as a firearm. He stepped into the warehouse. It stank of rust. It looked unused from the outside, but it seemed that wasn't the case. He carefully proceeded further in. At that moment, he noticed something move out of the corner of his eye. Kabuto-Numa turned and threw his pen at the shadow's neck area. The sharp ballpoint pen flew at high speed. But a mirror loudly broke. Unfortunately, he was too slow. He'd thrown the pen at the shadow in the mirror. For a moment, he was shocked at his own rookie mistake. Then, something suddenly collided with the back of his head. He collapsed to the concrete below. The last thing he saw was a discarded gun in front of him. When he came back to, he appeared to be in hospital. What on earth had happened? Had he been knocked out with the grip of the gun? How careless of him! It had all started going wrong back at that cafe. All this mess because he'd been a little curious. No, even thinking about going into that cafe for a break had been a mistake. He must have been knocked out with the gun and then brought here. What should he tell Kikyo? Still, there was something odd about the hospital room. At the very least, it didn't appear to be a hospital connected to Margaret, which meant that whoever knocked him out had brought him here. He couldn't relax just yet. Kabuto-Numa sat up. Physically, he appeared to be okay. First things first, he decided to take a look around. At that moment, he heard footsteps coming down the hall. He quickly dove back into the bed. 2 men entered the room. Has he been like this the whole time? Yes, seems he's still unconscious. His pulse is rather weak, so he might be done for. That's unfortunate, but it can't be helped. Let's keep an eye on him for a little while longer. Kabuto-Numa squinted and surveyed the 2 men. One was rather large and wearing sunglasses. The other looked young and lively. Neither of them looked like doctors. The 2 men briefly conversed about Kabuto-Numa's condition before leaving the room. This was no joke. Did they really not notice that he was awake? Those fools! Still, where on earth was he? He sat up again. He jumped down from the bed and walked with light steps. There really was no better physical recovery than sleep. Kabuto-Numa glanced at the clock on the wall. The time said it was 2 hours before he got knocked out, meaning, at best, nearly a full day had passed, and at worst, even more. Damn it! He didn't have the time for this. His comrades were no doubt waiting for him right now, worried. He had to get back right away. He took off his nightgown and changed into his clothes that were hanging on the side of the bed. Now he was ready. He opened the door a smidgen and peered into the hallway. It was empty. Concealing his footsteps, he stepped out into the hall. The lino floor looked clean. Seemed the building wasn't too large. He could clearly hear the noise coming from outside. Plus, he didn't smell that disinfectant smell particular to hospitals. He carefully proceeded down the hall. If he ran into someone in this small ward, then he'd have to come up with some excuse. As he reached the corner, he stuck his head out just a little to see around it. Then he quickly drew back. One of the doors facing the hall was open. Kabutonuma drew back and went to look for another way out. Yet, as he went to turn around, he heard the echo of footsteps coming from behind as well. Now he couldn't turn back. He would have to rush past the open room. Acting as normal as possible while concealing the sound of his own footsteps, Kabutonuma passed by the front of the door. He glanced inside the room, and two men in white coats were chatting. One of them turned to look at him, but he didn't seem to notice anything. Next, he passed by a single nurse on his way out. This time he was getting more confident, so he nodded in greeting as they passed each other. The nurse continued past him without so much as a smile. Like he wasn't even there at all. What a rude nurse. Still, even Kabutonuma was surprised. No matter how much of an elite operative the others called him, this was the first time he'd so easily escaped from somewhere. As he stepped outside, he looked up at the hospital sign. Asakura Office, Director, Asakura Tetsuji, it said. A chill ran down his spine. Although he was publicly known as a hospital director, in the underworld, Asakura Tetsuji was feared as a crime boss. Seemed he was tangled up in this job as well. Kabutonuma finally understood Kikyo's warning as he left the Margaret office. And that was why everyone else looked so stern as well. He looked up at the sky, and the usual summer sky looked back at him. But as expected, the afternoon rays had weakened somewhat. Kabutonuma set out for the main road to check the signs so that he could place where he was. He confirmed that he was close to the office. Close enough to walk there. Kabutonuma decided to walk back. But how much time had passed since he was knocked out? At any rate, he had to hurry back to the office. It was Asakura. And he was no doubt already looking into who Kabutonuma was. He looked at the date on a newspaper in a nearby convenience store. As he thought, more than one day had passed. Worry seized him, rising like columns of smoke in his chest. He ran the rest of the way to the office. The window facing the road was open. He ran up the stairs and pushed on the door, but something appeared to be caught on it and it wouldn't open. His worries became real. Kabutonuma gave up on opening the door and decided to go through the window. He climbed up the rain shutters and reached the window. He confirmed there was nobody standing on the street. Then, he jumped inside, and his expression froze. It was Kikyo Shinta's dead body that had the door stuck. Everybody was lying on the ground, covered in blood. For a moment, he doubted the sight before him, thinking they were playing a trick on him. But that was nothing more than an empty wish. Something inside him burst. Quite some time passed before he realized tears were streaming down his cheeks. Several days later, Kabutonuma's chance to get back at Asakura Tetsuji, the crime boss who had wiped out Margaret, finally arrived. He closed his eyes and looked back on his independent actions over the last few days, which felt long but had actually been short. Hitmen were generally lone wolves. Even if they were attached to an organization, when they worked, it was alone. But these last few days he'd especially been reminded of how alone he was. G. Wharf was already wrapped in darkness. His watch said 7:30. In 30 minutes, the boss Asakura would arrive. G. Wharf had a small park, but other than that, 2 large warehouses were the only things there. Perhaps Asakura was having his rendezvous at the park. He couldn't see anyone there. Whilst hiding in the bushes, Kabuto Nuna gripped a beer bottle cap in his pocket. By spinning this through the air, he would be able to cut through his opponent's carotid artery. He could use a knife, but to rely on such a regular weapon as that was nothing to be proud of for a professional killer such as himself. Especially this time, where the upcoming fight was a battle of vengeance for Margaret. He didn't want to end this so easily. The ocean wind was somewhat strong. If he didn't control it carefully, his weapon would never reach its mark. He'd never failed yet, but he still had to be careful. Several cars pulled up on the road in front of the park. Seemed they'd arrived. Kabuto Numa looked over and saw the tall guy from lunch. Seemed he was an executive for the boss. The guy with the brown shirt gripped the steering wheel in the front car. Now he was in navy work clothes. Kabuto Numa heard something explode inside himself once again. But now he had to be more calm than ever. He couldn't repeat his blunder from a few days earlier. Several men surrounded the big guy in sunglasses. The boss, Asakura Tetsuji. The target Kabuto Numa was betting his life on. Asakura was his one and only target. He couldn't care less about the others. As long as he got Asakura, then the rest of the organization would fall too. He gripped the bottle cap between his thumb and middle finger. Once he flung it, it would spin through the air and cut into Asakura's neck. Then he just had to wait for him to get into range. The men stayed close and entered the park. They were no doubt about to carry out a secret arms deal. From what he overheard earlier that day, this was a pretty big deal. The men stopped in the middle of the park. It was the perfect distance to embed the bottle cap in his throat. Yet, Asakura shadowed the tall guy, so he couldn't reach him from this angle. Would he have to move to get a good angle? No, hang on. A chance should present itself soon enough. At that moment, a man came running from the cars. He whispered something to Asakura. Asakura gave a small nod, and they all started returning to the cars. He couldn't let them leave like this. He was going to end this at the park, once and for all, so if they left, he'd be unable to follow them again. But it was also true that as Asakura started walking, a chance presented itself. Now was the time. He flung the cap immediately. He had a good feeling about this. Yet, Asakura didn't react. Did he miss? Maybe he was a little nervous. Thankfully, nobody seemed to notice. Kabuto Numa relaxed his shoulders, took out another bottle cap from his pocket, and took aim. This time he threw it more carefully. A satisfying shot. This one was right on the money. But Asakura didn't react again. His expression remained calm, and he spoke to the tall guy as they walked. Why? He had aimed right for Asakura's neck. But sitting here crying over it wouldn't solve anything. He had to carry out his revenge, no matter how he did it. Kabuto-numa crawled through the bushes, keeping distance with Asakura, and timed his shot once again. Asakura stopped. The tall guy was pointing at something. Luckily, both of them had their backs to him. Praying as he took out his third bottle cap, Kabuto-numa took careful aim at Asakura right in front of him and flung his weapon. The bottle cap cut through the wet, salty night air and hit Asakura's neck. He did it! Yet, the moment the thought crossed his brain, something unbelievable happened. The bottle cap that should have cut through his artery disappeared. The night wharf. The moon was out, but it was still hard to see anything. Had he just seen wrong? No, he was confident in his eyesight. It was part of his job. So then, what on earth happened? Kabuto-numa was confused, but he hadn't forgotten his goal. He'd run out of bottle caps, and although they weren't quite as aesthetic for a hitman, all he had left was either his knife or a direct confrontation. With that on his mind, suddenly a phone ring echoed throughout the park. The tall guy pulled a phone out of his pocket and, after exchanging a few words, handed it to his boss, Asakura. Asakura briefly spoke on the phone with a serious look on his face. Finally, once he got off the phone, Asakura and the tall guy alone started walking back to the cars. The rest of the men remained in the park. Kabuto-numa had no idea what was going on. At any rate, it seemed everyone other than Asakura and the tall guy were staying behind. But he didn't need to know what was going on with the deal. Now was his chance. There was only one person hanging around Asakura now. And, if that were the case, then he could do this. Kabuto-numa ran through the shadows of the bushes and, as he approached the exit, jumped out. Then he rushed for Asakura. If you were to stab someone in the back, most amateurs wouldn't be able to land a fatal hit. Even for an expert such as Kabuto-numa, he had to take care to make sure he finished the job. Asakura remained unaware of what was going on, and with his back to Kabuto-numa, went to step into the car. Keeping a cool head, Kabuto-numa aimed for the heart and thrust his knife into Asakura's back. He was right on the mark. He felt it. The knife had definitely gone in. Yet, he hadn't felt that particular resistance that comes with a knife entering the body, and before he could stop himself, he stumbled. The knife cut through air. No, more correctly, the knife in Kabuto-numa's hand went straight through Asakura's body without a sound. Not possible. This time, Kabuto-numa lost his cool. He chased after Asakura, stabbing blindly at his back. Die! Die! Yet the same thing happened again and again. Asakura stepped into the car like nothing had happened. The door closed behind him, and he left. He left Kabutonuma standing there, dumbfounded. What on earth was going on? Asakura had completely ignored his existence. How could he have done that? He had rejected Kabutonuma's very existence. Suddenly, he remembered something strange. His chest hurt. No, but there was no way. Kabutonuma desperately denied his own thoughts. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. Perhaps he actually died in that warehouse. He thought he'd just been knocked out by the gun, but maybe the impact hadn't been the handle of the gun, but rather the bullet itself. And he'd been carrying on all this time, not realizing he was actually dead. If he was right, then that was why he was able to get out of Asakura's clinic so easily, and why the two men hadn't noticed him at the amusement park. It explained everything. Thinking about it, the bottle caps and the knife should have killed Asakura. He hadn't picked them up anywhere over these last few days though, nor were they on his body beforehand, meaning he'd created them out of thin air. Am I a ghost? Thinking about it, it scarily explained everything. He had to confirm his fears. If he'd really taken a bullet through the forehead, then the wound should still be there. Kabutonuma tried touching his forehead. But there was nothing there at all.